I've talked quite a bit about the content of individual shots. In my video on shot composition, I discussed the consequences of how objects and characters are arranged within the frame, and in my video on camera angle, I talked about how the camera's orientation influences a viewer's relationship with and reaction to the subject of a shot. I've also discussed what I think is one of the most fascinating aspects of film studies, how individual shots are strung together to create a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. But today, I want to go back to analyzing individual shots. There's an important element of film that I haven't really addressed yet. The camera moves. This isn't always true. There are some early films with little to no camera movement, and some later films employ a static or near-static camera for artistic purposes. But typically, the camera is moving. This is a pretty unique feature of film, even among other visual media. If you're watching a play, your position relative to the action on stage is fixed. If you're looking at a painting, you always have the same perspective on the canvas's contents unless you yourself move. But a filmmaker can manipulate both the action on screen and the viewer's perspective on it, all without switching to a different shot. In other words, the filmmaker can reposition the viewer. So how do we make sense of camera movement and figure out how filmmakers use it to create an emotional effect for viewers? As usual, we'll use Film Studies and Introduction by Ed Sikov to build a vocabulary that we can use to analyze camera movement. First, when the camera itself is stationary but pivots on its axis from side to side, it's called a pan. If the camera is stationary but tilts up and down, it's called a tilt or a vertical pan. Sikov likens these camera movements to moving your head while you remain stationary. If you were standing in the corner of a room, you could look around the whole thing with a combination of tilts and pans, all while the rest of your body stays still. But things get a little more interesting when the camera can actually move around. One way to do this is to simply put the camera on something that's moving, like a vehicle or some special piece of equipment meant specifically for the camera. Sikov calls this a moving shot. If the camera is moving parallel to the ground, so it's not changing in elevation relative to the surface that it's on, we call it a tracking shot or dolly. A dolly is a cart used to carry the camera in this kind of shot. Sikov talks about an amusing piece of Hollywood film lore. Crews used to actually construct a kind of mini railroad track for the camera. If it was closely tracking an actor, that actor would have to step high enough to get over the ties, or the piece perpendicular to the tracks, in order to move. The vertical equivalent, where the camera moves up or down, is called a crane. This frequently involves something like a cherry picker or lift, but these days a drone can also achieve this effect. So, a quick lingo review. If the camera is stationary but pivots side to side, it's a pan. If it pivots up and down, it's a tilt or vertical pan. In a moving shot, the camera is actually changing position and not just rotating on an axis. If it's moving parallel to the ground, we have a dolly. If it's moving up or down, it's a crane. In the 1960s, there was an innovation that opened up a whole new frontier for camera movement. Film cameras used to be so big and unwieldy that they needed to be stationary or mounted on some piece of equipment in order to move. This all changed with the advent of handheld cameras and handheld shots, which only became possible after technology advanced to the point where cameras could be made much smaller. Sikov discusses how filmmakers in the 1960s began using handheld cameras as a convention of realism. As he describes it, the jerkiness of handheld shots seemed to suggest an unmediated reality, a lack of intervention between camera and subject. As a quick aside, it's quite clear that Sikov is fairly firm in his belief that the realistic nature of handheld shots is purely conventional, but there's nothing about this particular style that is necessarily realistic apart from the fact that people interpret it that way. In fact, of course, a handheld shot isn't any more realistic than any other kind of shot. It is a stylistic convention, a visual sign that people still read as expressing heightened realism. I don't completely agree with this. I think it is partly true that we read handheld shots as realistic because of the fact that they've been used for decades to communicate realism, but I think there is something uniquely organic about them. Maybe it's because we live in a world filled with shaky cell phone videos, but a handheld shot does, at least for me, evoke somebody picking up a camera and filming something that is unfolding in front of them, far more than something like a tracking shot. But that doesn't mean that handheld shots should always be interpreted in the same way. Even if they often communicate realism, different filmmakers could want to evoke realism for wildly divergent reasons. But anyway, many filmmakers really did begin to lean on handheld cameras in order to emphasize this idea of realistic cinema. This development was particularly central to the French New Wave, a movement that involved filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut, and it's certainly worth checking out some of their work to get a sense of the frontiers opened up by the handheld camera. Take, for instance, the opening to Truffaut's The 400 Blows, in which we get a beautiful handheld introduction to Paris that feels incredibly down-to-earth, even as it constantly looks up, which may reflect the simultaneous struggle and hope of the film's protagonist. But with the advent of the Steadicam, which is a kind of mobile stabilizer that attaches to the camera operator, filmmakers got access to a tool that allowed for both the smoothness of tracking shots and the mobility of handheld shots. Sikov then brings us to the concept of zoom. The camera is not actually moving when it zooms, but it creates the illusion of it. The concept of focal length is very important here, so here's a very brief overview. Cameras function by focusing light on a piece of film, or more commonly these days, a digital sensor. Light passes through the lens, which focuses it on a particular point. The distance to that point is the focal length, and varying the focal length creates radically different visual effects. A wide-angle shot, which has a short focal length, captures a broader view and has a deeper depth of field, meaning more of the shot is in focus. A telephoto shot with a longer focal length will capture a narrow view and have a shallower depth of field, which is used all the time to bring a subject into focus while keeping the background blurred. A zoom involves either increasing or decreasing the focal length within the same shot by using a lens with variable focus. We can distinguish between movements, or simulated movements like zooms, that are initiated by the action on screen, and movements that are not. Motivated camera movements are those that are prompted by the characters and events in the film. Unmotivated camera movements are those that pertain to the filmmaker's commentary on characters and events. So if a character moves and the camera follows them, that's a motivated camera movement. But if the movement does not correspond to what's happening on screen, that's unmotivated. Unmotivated camera movements are fascinating because they provide us with a window into what the filmmaker wants us to take away from a particular shot. For instance, a zoom in on a stationary character's face is not motivated by any motion on the part of the character, but rather by the director's desire to emphasize something about that character. Perhaps the fact that they are at an inflection point in their life, that they're having some kind of major realization that will radically affect them going forward. Filmmakers can get pretty fancy with camera movement during long takes, a single continuous shot that goes on for an extended period of time. Since there are no cuts, filmmakers will often use a string of carefully orchestrated movements. As Sikov phrases it, a kind of editing within the shot is often at play here. Like any technique, long takes can be used to create all kinds of effects, and this is going to depend significantly on the kind of camera movement that takes place within that continuous shot. For instance, in this shot from The Revenant, we begin with slow, deliberate movements that get more frantic as glass is on the cusp of being caught. The pans become quicker and the shot becomes just a little bit shakier, and the fact that there are no cuts makes us feel like pursuers are closing in on us as we dare to peer around the side of a rock. But in my opinion, one of the best parts of studying film is seeing how similar techniques are used to create wildly different effects in different contexts. For instance, take long takes to the extreme and you get Birdman, a 2-hour film made to look like it consists of one shot. Unlike the long take I showed from The Revenant, Birdman doesn't produce fear. It doesn't generate the sense of being pursued. The continuous take, for me, creates a kind of frenetic energy and maybe reflects the pressure and restlessness that Riggin feels as he attempts to rekindle his former glory. Or take Alfred Hitchcock's Rope. The long takes certainly mimic the experience of watching a play, which makes sense since Rope is adapted from a stage play. But they also make the viewer feel complicit in the crime as they watch it unfold. It's also worth reflecting on the absence of movement, which has been used to great effect in various films. Take Tokyo Story by Ozu. Why might he have opted to shoot the film almost entirely with static shots? Think about the kind of story he's telling. This is a film about an elderly couple that feels left behind by their children and the world as a whole. Perhaps that is exactly what the static camera conveys, the sense of the world passing by while you're standing still, feeling that constant change is inevitable, but all you can do is watch it happen. This brings me to a point that I've emphasized in pretty much every video I've done about a technical element of film. In order to develop a full understanding of a movie, it's important to reflect on how the techniques of the medium are used in order to generate meaning. Shot composition and editing and sound and camera movement and any other technical element should not be viewed as aesthetic window dressing for the film's plot. They make up the language of cinema. So when you see a pan or crane or dolly or a long take or a near total absence of movement, ask yourself why. What themes does this film address, and how does the filmmaker use camera movement to say something about those themes? Don't settle for one-size-fits-all interpretations. Zooming in on an object does not always mean the same thing, nor does the use of a shaky handheld camera. Evaluate each technique and the synthesis of multiple techniques within the context of each film. Thanks for watching.